It's been almost 6 months since Final Fantasy VII Rebirth released, which feels kind of odd to say. But here we are, and after another rather creative ending that left us with more questions than answers, it's led to a decent amount of speculation around, well, what's next? And just as it did after the release of Remake, this applies to both the project as a whole and also the direction the narrative may take. Now, thus far, Square Enix has preferred to direct the majority of their recent attention towards Rebirth, as they try to continue driving sales to ensure there's a solid, long tail leading into the next part. But despite this focus, the developers have also started to reveal small snippets of information relating to what, at this point, can only really be dubbed Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. These conversations have come through numerous interviews conducted with third-party publications and question and answer forums at conventions. And while the subject of these interviews has often been to reflect and dive more into what was seen within Rebirth, naturally, on the odd occasion, conversation has shifted towards the future. Throughout this video, we're going to look to compile every morsel of information disclosed so far about Remake Part 3. And we're going to do so in our typical granular style, because while we may not be the fastest to talk about news, we always try our best to be the most diligent, so you don't have to be. Before we do though, I wanted to let everyone know that we will be conducting an intriguing survey relating to the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole. We've condensed the franchise down into just under 60 major properties, and all you have to do is rate them out of 5 while providing a few thoughts around the main numbered entries and their sequels. It should only hopefully take a few minutes, and the link can be found in the description below. The results should serve as a fantastic barometer of current sentiment and will act as the backbone for a much larger project we hope to publish before the end of the year. As always, the more responses we get, the better the results. So anything you can do to share the survey around will be much appreciated. But with that, let's dive into the video. We've known since mid-2022 that the Final Fantasy VII Remake project will be a trilogy. Up until this point, the actual number of entries for the project was still undecided, and Kitase even revealed that due to the performance of Remake, they were considering condensing it down to be only 2 games. However, after the majority of the development team were forced to stay together due to the extraordinary circumstances that affected almost the entire world throughout 2020 and 2021, they became incredibly efficient at making Final Fantasy VII Remake games. Kitase therefore felt that development costs should decrease, and this made a trilogy much more financially viable. Alongside the announcement of the trilogy, Tetsuya Nomura revealed that provisional development work began on Remake Part 3 back in 2022, almost 2 years before Rebirth ended up being shipped. This represents a similar timeline to Remake and Rebirth, as Nomura, who of course served as the director of the first game, revealed via Square Enix's own blog that work on Rebirth actually commenced in 2019. It's therefore difficult to establish how far into development they actually are, but the script has apparently now been completed. This news came also via Nomura, who spoke in the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth Ultimania. According to Audrey, Nomura said the script for Remake Part 3 is now finished, and they are looking to begin voice recording in the near future. If true, it means they have worked quite fast, as only a few months before, Naoki Hamaguchi, who served as the director of Rebirth, shared that they had not yet finalized the script. When speaking with French video game journalist Julien Chiez, Hamaguchi noted that they're in a similar space now after the release of Rebirth to where they were after the release of Remake. He said, "When we got to the end of development for Remake, we started talking about the sequel with Kazushige Nojima, and I think we can say that we're in the same situation today." This could point towards them still making slight adjustments based on how the community responded to the conclusion of Rebirth and other elements of the story. Hamaguchi has, for example, noted before that they are acutely aware of community sentiment and are eager to see how they respond to the various plot twists that they impose. This could then be a reason as to why the scenario, despite being based on an already existing story, could not be finished ahead of the next part being released, which in this case was Rebirth. as if consumers didn't react in the way they expected, revisions may be required. If the script has now indeed been finished, perhaps we all just responded in exactly the way that they expected. Hamaguchi has also shared that the team are considering switching from Unreal Engine 4 to Unreal Engine 5. However, one of the biggest considerations relates to whether this would have a significant impact on total development time. When speaking with CG World, Hamaguchi said, "I think what our users want most right now is to deliver the final game in the series in a good form as soon as possible. So, if they can accomplish this while also trying to learn Unreal Engine 5, they'll make the switch. If not, they will continue with the old engine and make do with all the custom enhancements they've made." In terms of upcoming content, we know that even though Rebirth was a very substantial game, there is still a lot more that Part 3 has the potential to contain. And this relates to locations such as Wutai and Medeal, but also additional content such as the weapons. Ahead of Rebirth, the core development team had put out messaging to suggest that even though the core path the party takes will ultimately be the same, the order may change. And one of the areas most affected by this was Wutai. Speaking just over a year ago via the PlayStation blog, Nomura shared that Wutai would serve as a prominent example of this mantra, stating Wutai, one of the major locations, is not part of the route in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and will be visited in the next one. It's unclear why this decision was taken, but it's easy to theorize that it was to give Wutai more focus. In the original game, Wutai was an optional location, but even in the early parts of Remake, it became clear that the Remake project as a whole would place more emphasis on the region. Wutai was injected into the story thanks to numerous monologues from President Shinra, and more emphasis was placed around the broader organization of Avalanche, with it clear that Barrett's group was just one cell. As for how Wutai will manifest, well, there is some speculation that it could arrive via downloadable content, thus retaining its optional nature and building upon the way Yuffie's story was delivered via intermission. Alternatively, it could play a crucial part in the story of Part 3 as a way of building Yuffie out as a fully realised character, as those who didn't play intermission were missing crucial context around her narrative development. This sentiment has also been applied to Rocket Town. Based on the path taken, the party should have ventured to Rocket Town for some much needed Cid Highwind exposition, but due to how the scenario writers chose to incorporate Cid in Rebirth, and with there being increased emphasis placed on Gongaga as a location, there was no need for them to visit Rocket Town anymore. At the moment, it means Rocket Town is not in their current narrative plans, but Hamaguchi did share that he is discussing with Nomura and Nojima whether it makes sense for them to bring back Rocket Town for Part 3. For now though, it does mean they have been able to casually skirt around how to deal with depicting the relationship between Cid and Shira. The shift also allowed them to expand in other areas, such as Zack Fair's past, and this also dovetailed with their wider objective of introducing elements from the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. After being introduced in Before Crisis as Shuriken, and having her role expanded in Crisis Core, Cissnei has become a fan favourite, and this notion was only amplified following the release of Crisis Core Reunion. Her appearance in Rebirth was celebrated, and based on how characters were carried forth from Remake to Rebirth, it's safe to assume that we'll be seeing more of Cissnei in the future, but there could also be more opportunities for characters from the compilation. Hamaguchi shared that whenever we present characters that have originally appealed and appeared in the compilation title for Final Fantasy VII, we've seen very positive feedback, so it's clearly something they want to continue doing. That then brings us onto the elephant in the room, Cid and Vincent. Both characters featured in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but they were not playable, and how this manifested was not in line with what players expected. The precedent for this approach was set in Remake, as Red 13 appeared as an uncontrollable guest character. However, in Rebirth, Cid and Vincent almost always watched from the sidelines. Their inclusion was still appreciated, but compared to Red 13, the tease was all the more tantalizing. And based on how gameplay was incorporated around Cait Sith, it's going to be fascinating to see how Vincent and Cid both end up playing. When speaking with Variety, Hamaguchi shared that the reason they held the gameplay aspects back for Vincent and Sid so strongly was to make sure that they still had surprises to keep fans excited for the future. Hamaguchi said that to work along with this notion, they didn't want to realize everything all at once and wanted to keep the excitement and anticipation going for these two characters. Hamaguchi also shared in the same breath that this could even manifest through downloadable content. Without specifically being prompted by the interviewer, Hamaguchi said, "While I don't have any clear DLC information to share with you, we know it'd be very exciting for players to have new playable characters going into future titles." That then brings us onto more supplemental content. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth featured more minigames than even the most hardcore of fans could have anticipated. Many of them were repurposed from the original game and reimagined for modern audiences. But there was also room for some original minigames to creep in, and one of them was an addictive card game called Queen's Blood. Such has been the positive response to Queen's Blood that there has been an outpouring of demand for a standalone version to be released, and during a fan Q&A at Otakon, Hamaguchi addressed this demand. He stopped short of saying that a standalone version was in the works, but he did share that they are now preparing a better version of Queen's Blood for the next title, and they are hoping to share more information about that in the near future. That seems like pretty fantastic news, and it's going to be very interesting to see how Queen's Blood evolves. In terms of the broader scope of Part 3 though, there are numerous options available to the development team, and it all depends on how they want to play with financial risk. When working on the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, in light of diminishing returns, the third game had its budget slashed and it led to the development team deviating away from the previous two games to create something that was more abstract and unorthodox. They hoped that taking this approach, while also giving it the more edgy name of Lightning Returns, would encourage new fans to check the game out. But Lightning Returns ended up being the lowest scoring mainline entry in the Final Fantasy series to date, as well as the worst selling in the modern era. Square Enix has yet to release figures around the sale of Rebirth, but estimates state that it may have sold around half of Remake. This then follows a similar trajectory of 13 and 13-2. That's not to say that Part 3 will have its budget slashed like Lightning Returns did, as Square Enix can't really afford to take such an approach with their flagship title, especially after the incredible critical performance of Rebirth. But Hamaguchi did reportedly say at Otakon that, compared to Rebirth, Part 3 will be another exciting experience, and the transition will be similar to the one witnessed between Remake and Rebirth. This statement can of course be taken multiple ways, but it does mean that Part 3 could be very different from Rebirth. We're hopeful though that it means the quality and scope will be raised even higher. It's just also difficult to see how this could be justified given the financial outlay involved. Which brings us onto the speculated release window. Square Enix are intimately aware that they need to release Part 3 as soon as possible without there being a diminishment in quality. The longer the game takes, the more money they spend. This sentiment was also shared by Hamaguchi in relation to that potential switch from Unreal Engine 4 to 5, and it means there are a few scenarios available to them depending on how they choose to approach development. According to Hamaguchi, Rebirth spent 3 full years in development with 1 year of prototyping, which happened concurrently with the development of Intergrade and Intermission. If they therefore choose to skip producing downloadable content this time around, it means early 2027 is actually a realistic release window for Part 3. Kitase has also confirmed that the team will be sticking together again, and with the same efficiencies and with so many more assets now created, it means development should be much quicker than ever before. But that then brings us on to the question of scope. If they want Part 3 to be even bigger than Rebirth, then they could choose to take the full 4 years to ensure the trilogy ends with a bang. But there is also still the potential for downloadable content to be produced, and if either of those two scenarios were to occur, then early 2028 becomes the more realistic target release window. The only challenge with 2028, however, is that Sony has signaled that the PlayStation 5 will be in its swan song by then, and quite often, releasing games towards the back end of a console generation can lead to diminished sales as there's just so much competition in the market and eyes are already focused on what comes next. But it could still work in Square Enix's favour, as Part 3 could be developed as a cross-generational game, releasing on the PlayStation 5 and PlayStation 6 as a way of driving more sales. And who knows, they could even release a trilogy pack that contains all of the games, with the first 2 parts remastered to take advantage of the new hardware, similar to the approach taken by Naughty Dog with The Last of Us. Either way, Q1 2027 or Q1 2028 seem like the 2 most logical release windows. But please let us know in the comments below when you believe the game will be released. But with that, you're all caught up with the latest news relating to Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. Before you leave, please do take the survey I mentioned at the beginning of the video by checking out the link in the description, and if you enjoyed the update, we'd very much appreciate if you could toss the video a like. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube members and supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Juan Jaramillo, Justin Dent, and Zukan TDK, who are super special Onion supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.